Guantanamo Bay was a big lie. It was created by the Bush administration to convince the American people that we were doing something tough about terrorism. And Donald Rumsfeld said that everyone in Guantanamo Bay was the worst terrorist of the world. I read Pervez Musharraf's rather dreadful autobiography called In the Line of Fire, and I think it's on page 237 that he says that more than half of the prisoners in Guantanamo ended up there because officials in Pakistan were taking millions of dollars in monetary payments to turn them in. I heard about Guantanamo on January the 11th, 2002, the very moment that it was opened. And frankly, I was horrified. It was actually very hard to find people who were willing to take on the Bush administration. And in the end, it was just the three of us. And we brought the first case against Guantanamo, Rasool versus Bush, on behalf of three British people. We brought that on, February the 19th, 2002, and it turned out to be a much bigger task than I think I had anticipated. It took us 2.5 years going through district courts and the Court of Appeal, where we were roundly slapped down by the judges who said, the United States has the right to hold people however they want in this war. And it wasn't until we got to the United States Supreme Court, which I think crucially was timed after the Abu Ghraib photographs. And I think it was those photographs that first truly convinced the world that the United States just totally lost the plot and that we were going around torturing people in the name of democracy. I started discovering these amazing bounty flyers. And it turns out that what we were doing is, basically what the United States does far too often, which is we were offering money to people to turn in basically Muslim men with beards. I read Pervez Musharraf's rather dreadful autobiography called In the Line of Fire, and I think it's on page 237 that he says that more than half of the prisoners in Guantanamo ended up there because officials in Pakistan were taking millions of dollars in monetary payments to turn them in. And this actually turns out to be how the majority of people ended up in Guantanamo Bay. One of the people that I still represent in Guantanamo Bay, who's from Karachi, Ahmed Rabbani, was sold to the United States on February the 10th, 2002 for $5,000. And he was sold with a story saying he was a wicked, evil terrorist called Hassan Gul. And the first thing Ahmed said was, no, I'm not. I'm Ahmed Rabbani. I'm a taxi driver from Karachi. And the US government just wouldn't believe it. They paid good money for that. So they took Ahmed and they tortured him in the dark prison. The US government did things to him that the Spanish Inquisition did to people 500 or 600 years ago, including what's called stripado, where they hung him up by his wrists, so his toes were just touching the ground, and gradually your shoulders dislocate in a way that's just astoundingly painful. But we were very small as a group. My job was to wander around the world trying to find the families of people. When I went to lots of countries, first I'd put my hands up and I'd say to a group of, very angry family members who just couldn't understand why their loved ones had been so abused and were being held without any legal rights in this awful prison. I do apologize for what America's done, because it's been very, very wrong. And you're not going to get an apology from our government, so you may as well take it from me. That was great in the sense that it immediately would calm down, lower the temperature in the room. But then what I would do is offer to the family members that if they wanted to give me authorization, I would get them free lawyers in the United States to represent their loved one. And so that's what I did. And I must have met hundreds of these family members in scores of countries, including there in Pakistan, in order to just offer to try to put right the wrong that we were committing against their loved ones. We assembled a task force of 500 lawyers high-powered lawyers in big law firms. And they came under threat too. I remember when one of the Bush administration people was trying to get corporations to sack the corporate lawyers who dared be representing these evil Muslim terrorists. I went down to Jordan and, all I was doing, I held a press conference, told the people that I was there to help and that I'd like to meet the families and offer help. And, that was all going fine. And then I get a call from the secret police. And it was actually a guy called Colonel Ali Borjak, who was pretty notorious because he was the first foreign intelligence officer allowed into Guantanamo Bay. And they said I had to report to the secret police headquarters at once. I said, I'm sorry, I'm busy. I'm not coming, and so then they kept calling. In the end, they were very threatening. So I finally just got in a taxi to go over there. And the taxi driver, when I said where I wanted to go, dropped me off about 300 yards away. So I walked in there. It was the secret police headquarters. So I'm walking down these long corridors with white walls and took me into this room and these two people sitting there, and I go up in a sort of friendly, cheerful way and say, hello, I'm Clive, who are you? And this one guy who I later identified as Colonel Borjak said, we do not use names here. And they start getting all hostile. I told them, look, I've told the government, the British government, that if I'm not out in a couple of hours, they're to come and get me. And they eventually calmed down and eventually they did put a tail on me. They let me go. And they were angry because I'd said there were 34 Jordanians in Guantanamo, which was the number the Americans had said. But he said, no, there were not, there were only 8. Well, I said, well, give me their names and give me the details of their families and I'll go and offer free representation to them. And in the end, because I'd been a bit pompous and threatened them with all sorts of stuff, they did. They told me where everyone was. And it was the first time I got cooperation from a secret service. At the very beginning, of course, I hadn't been able to get into Guantanamo. In June 2004, we won in the US Supreme Court. So at that point, we could actually go visit the prisoners. I remember a little game I played, which was to get the censored postcards that the families would send to the prisoners from my clients and see what was being censored, because it was just this madness. And the thing that was just weirdest was the US was censoring all numbers because they had this deranged notion that numbers were somehow a communication method between Al-Qaeda people. Your son might send a postcard to you in Guantanamo saying, I had a lovely 8th birthday, and the 8th would be crossed out. And I would compare the original to the one that was censored and discover this silliness. Guantanamo Bay was a big lie. It was created by the Bush administration to convince the American people that we were doing something tough about terrorism. And Donald Rumsfeld said that everyone in Guantanamo Bay was the worst terrorist of the world. And when I first went there in 2004, it must be said, I thought, I'm going to have some explaining to do for some of these guys. And I was mainly about principle that, no matter who you are, you have the right to a fair process. But I thought most people probably would have been caught up fighting on the battlefield of Afghanistan. But when I got to Guantanamo, I was actually quite taken aback. It was people like Mozambique. It was quite hard to find an honest-to-goodness terrorist. There were 780 prisoners total. We've got 741 out, each with pretty much all of them have been determined by the US government to be no threat to the United States or its coalition allies, which, if I translate that into plain English, means that we've got the wrong person 96% of the time. The list of the names was a top secret until 2006. And so no one was allowed to know who these people were in Guantanamo. One of the issues as I developed my own list that was very interesting was we used a series of numbers to represent people in Guantanamo, called your internment serial number. I was just really intrigued by the fact that they would number them from 1 through to, the thousands, and they would miss numbers out. When we first started matching the numbers that we used in Guantanamo with the numbers that we used in Bagram, where they had a different set of numbers, it became very clear that the US government had just transposed numbers from Bagram to Guantanamo in the same order they had in Bagram, so lots of people were missing. And by looking at the different numbers, you could identify the fact that there were many people who had gone missing. And so I had a project from the earliest days, which was to try to identify these missing people to see what had happened to them. Some of them had died in Bagram. I think a total of 8 people died in Bagram. But some of them had been taken to secret prisons elsewhere. And, all of this came to a head in September 2004, when there was a flight, which I've always called the torture flight, into Guantanamo, where there were 10 prisoners brought in. There was a series of guys whose numbers were from 1452 to 1463. Those people had been taken to Jordan, to Egypt, to Morocco for horrendous torture before they were taken to Bagram and then before they were taken to Guantanamo Bay. I wrote 30 pages about everything Mosem had told me about his torture and abuse and about how he had witnessed a prisoner being murdered in Bagram Air Force Base, and also 3 pages about the mental illness, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder that he was suffering and so forth. And the censors censored every single page. And in the end, what we did was we got the censors to black out everything they wouldn't let out of there. I wrote a letter to Tony Blair, which was like 2 pages detailing some of this stuff, and they blacked out everything except the first sentence, which said, "In re torture of British nationals in Guantanamo and elsewhere." And then the last sentence, which said, "Anything that's been blacked out here, your friends, the United States, don't want you to know about how they're torturing our citizens of Clive." And that was allowed out, and we published that in the paper. And that was a huge embarrassment to the US government, and people started going on hunger strike. And this culminated in 2005, 2006 in a very big hunger strike. And I said to my clients then, when a tree falls in the forest, if no one knows, what's the point? Did it even happen? So it was very much our job as lawyers, legitimately, to get out the truth about hunger strikes. And to begin with, the US military was actually pretty good about it, and they let us do that. And it was really embarrassing to them to learn the stories of why these prisoners were going on hunger strike. And it was all about their mistreatment. They'd left a tube up the prisoner's nose, and that was less painful, and they'd force feed them. But then General Craddock said they were going to make it more painful so that the prisoners wouldn't go on strike. And so instead of leaving this 110 centimeter tube up your nose, they'd pull it out after each force feeding twice a day, and then they'd use a bigger tube, which was more painful, and they'd force more liquid in faster to make it more painful. So we were trying to reveal how horrible this was. The UN deemed it intentional torture. But one of my concerns was my clients. I don't want them to die. I respect their desire to go on a peaceful hunger strike. So one of my motives, when Shaka was about to kill himself on this hunger strike, I thought the best way to persuade him out of it would be to adopt his hunger strike. And so I got a lot of celebrities to agree to take the hunger strike on for a day or 2. And I did it myself for a week. I did it twice for a week. So there's no question that all of this went to the highest reaches of government. There's no question that these people have never been held responsible for it. But one thing we got to do is make sure that the world learns these lessons of history.